have a year-long exploration by the STEP Center on the theme of natures. We're hosting events and convening lots of things, delving deeply into different relationships with the natures that we perceive in the world, and exploring key questions around the language of crisis, coloniality, domination, alternatives, and future making. Um, Today's event is really exciting. This is the final event of 2020, the final event of the Nature's Year for the STEP Center. And today we're welcoming Professor Bram Büscher, author of The Truth About Nature, Environmentalism in the Era of Post-Truth Politics and Platform Capitalism, which is actually released today by the University of California Press. And we're also welcoming Elizabeth Havis and Max Ritts, who will be acting as discussants after a brief introduction from Bram. And then we'll be opening the event to questions and comments, roundtable style. So thanks to everyone for attending. And if you're ready, I will hand it over to Bram.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Amber, to you and to Nathan for organizing, and to all for joining. It's a real pleasure here to be speaking together with Elizabeth and Max. And it's particularly exciting to be speaking here, as part of the nature's theme of the STEP Center. As this theme asks, several pertinent questions that I think are quite central to the book as well. So one of the questions that you ask is, how is talk of crisis shaping nature and people's views of it? So how is talk of crisis shaping nature and people's views of it? And so the easy and probably correct answer is, it depends, right? It depends on what crisis, what nature, and what people you are talking about. So for example, in my book, I have a chapter about the rhino poaching crisis in South Africa. And I show how this crisis and the rhino natures it refers to have a very different meaning for different groups of people in South Africa. And especially how these meanings differ across racialized lines. Obviously, it gets maybe a bit trickier if you talk about the climate crisis, which for many people is more abstract and dangerous than a rhino. Although I guess it depends, whether you're standing in front of it or not. But still, the answer might be similar, right? It depends. It depends on whether you're a farmer or an academic in terms of how you're impacted by climate change. And then again, it also depends on where you farm or where you labor as an academic. And all of this most certainly would be true, and we could go on like this for a little while. But no matter how true, the answer of it depends does not really seem to cut it anymore for many environmentalists, right? They are convinced that the environmental crisis is dire, urgent, and global, and needs attention and action by all actors right now. And this is in the news all the time. So just even last week, Greta Thunberg, who's been very explicit about all of this, stated, "We are speeding in the wrong direction on the climate crisis." And she's right. I would agree with that. And I would guess so do many of you, right? We would agree that the global environmental condition we are in is incredibly worrisome, and it demands urgent action from many players. So perhaps there's more than just it depends. Perhaps there really is a more general truth about nature, namely that it is in a bad state, but that with action, perhaps, hopefully, we can still get to a more sustainable future. And many environmentalists think of it that way, like David Attenborough certainly believes this to be the case. He recently asked his viewers if they're now finally ready for the truth about nature, which he directly equated with the state of the planet. And others, of course, also demand that this truth is acknowledged, like for example, the Extinction Rebellion movement and many others. And importantly for me in the book, all of these actors make avid use of new digital tools and online platforms to share this truth about nature. So perhaps, or maybe the question is how to combine it depends with the truth about nature. And I know this sounds a little bit dangerous or perhaps even erratic, especially for political ecologists and social scientists who are generally rather skeptical of proclamations of the truth and or generalized truth claims. Because truth, like everything else, is a construction, of course. And as Latour had it, quote, adds only little supplement to a trial of strength in discursive political battles. Right? The term truth, of course, is also highly laden, something that sounds heavy, and few scholars use it anymore or try to make it productive as an analytical concept. So one of the main arguments I actually make in the book is that this is a mistake. That if we are to make sense of and respond to environmental crises, we need to learn how to combine it depends with the truth about nature, analytically, empirically, and politically. Or as I refer to it in the book, learn how to combine solid ground with shifting sand in terms of our epistemological politics. And there are many reasons for this, but two are most important. First, what if there is indeed truth in the environmental crisis? Right? Should we not take this seriously? And second, how do we deal with the emergence of post-truth? If you find post-truth troubling, as do I, does that not mean getting back to an idea of truth in some form or another? And if so, how do we do that? And especially in relation to such a contested term as nature, right? Which, of course, for that reason alone, I guess the SEP Center doesn't refer to nature, but natures in the plural. So how I deal with these questions in the book and the need to combine it depends with the truth about nature is to relate them to the question of power. And I do so in 4 ways. In terms of political economy, in relation to the messiness of everyday life, thirdly, philosophically or meta-theoretically, and lastly, politically. So what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is to briefly discuss these 4 elements to bring power, nature, and truth together in order to highlight some of the key arguments of the book. The overarching intervention of this particular talk, however, singles out one particular argument that I want to highlight. Namely that if we are to confront power as part of trying to deal with contemporary environmental crises, then we have to say something truthful about this power. So that means that while truth itself is always power, it is at the same time also more than power. Now let me take the 4 steps to try to get back to that argument. So via political economy, everyday life, philosophy, and politics. So as you all know, truth and nature cannot be discussed without discussing power, right? Not just from a Foucauldian point of view, where truth and power cannot be separated, but also from a very practical point of view. If the truth about nature is indeed that we are in a major global environmental crisis, then, at least so think many environmentalists, we need to change the powerful, or at least convince those in power that this is a serious problem. So you can, for example, cozy up to the powerful, imitate the language of power, or confront power, or do yet other strategies, or do all of these at the same time. So much of my previous own personal research trajectory has been about trying to understand how environmentalists cozy up to power, or even try to imitate power, and how they've tried to turn nature into natural capital, to serve it in bite-sized chunks to the rich and the powerful, to speak nature to power, and to tell the powerful that it's all okay, right? That they can continue to accumulate and pursue their egoistic instincts. And indeed, they can do so even better now, as they can also profit from conserving nature and saving the world at the same time. So how great is that, right? Win, 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 win. Clearly, not everybody buys into this tactic or feels good about that, right? At the same time, many environmentalists have also been confronting and resisting power, or challenging others to say that cozying up to the powerful may not actually be such a great idea. Now, these and other ways of relating environmental crisis and truth to power continue to change, and it's important to critically study them, especially so now, since I believe something rather fundamental has taken place in the last 15 to 20 years that has transformed this entire equation. Something we all know, but is not nearly studied enough yet in political ecology or environmental studies more broadly. Because both those who try to cozy up to the powerful and those who resist dominant forms of power avidly use digital and social media platforms to make their case and to communicate their concerns and goals. All of them share their ideas about nature's truths and power, or their critiques of it over social media, hoping that others will listen. And I do too. Yet the power that some try to get in bed with and others try to resist has secretly, swiftly, and rather fundamentally changed itself in ways that we are only starting to fully comprehend. In other words, the nature of power in the world has been changing quickly over the last 20 years, and we need to say something truthful about it if we are to catch up. And I'm clearly not saying this to cozy up to this new form of power, but in order to confront it. So this for me is where political economy comes in. So I see political economy as the study of structural forms of power, right? Especially the power of contemporary capitalism. I see this as something rather solid. This is what structural means to me. So while it does change, it also has some stable features that continue over time. So in this case, long-standing structural features of the political economy of capitalism, like its need for growth and accumulation, its need for profit and seeing the world essentially instrumentally as resources to feed these, have now morphed due to the rise of online digital platforms, rendering the new form of political economic power that of platform capitalism, as Nick Srnicek has it, or in Shoshana Zuboff's term, surveillance capitalism. And this new form of political economic power is highly consequential, and much can be said about it. But here I just want to touch on one feature, namely how it leads to a dangerous, vicious cycle when it comes to trying to take action on the environmental crises and to share truths or critiques about this online. So this vicious cycle goes as follows. When sharing online, environmentalists get themselves into a political economy of platform capitalism that thrives on the sharing, co-creation, and individualization of products and information online, including everything, right? Including truths and natures, etc., while turning all of these into commodifiable data. The contradictory effect of this online sharing and co-creation is that what is actually true no longer matters to platforms. It is all profitable as data. So to put it bluntly, why I would be interested to save nature becomes secondary or indeed totally irrelevant to the information that I want to save nature by virtue of my online clicking, browsing, and viewing choices. And the truth, according to algorithms, is the latter. So in this model, any truth or lie could potentially be as profitable as any other truth or lie. Platform capitalism, in other words, is literally beyond truth, which is why I argue that it is responsible for the emergence of post-truth. And it also brings me back to my point about power and how this has been changing. So just to make it absolutely clear, the power the power of platform capitalism is post-truth. Or phrased a little bit differently, post-truth I see as an expression of power under platform capitalism. So in this way, post-truth also plays into the hands of capitalist power more generally, which actually intensifies rather than weakens the overall political economy responsible for the current environmental predicament. Now, this vicious cycle, right, is a stark warning. Platform capitalism and post-truth power are dangerous, right? Not just dangerous for nature, but also, as we have very clearly seen in relation to the US presidential election over the last weeks and months, that I think has been quite exhausting for everybody, for democracy and society more broadly. And it's therefore very interesting to see that so many states in the US, right, Republican and Democratic states, have now said that they want to break up Facebook, right, that they want to sort of break up this new solid form of structural power. So in the critical, in the bigger picture of all of this, right, this is really important also in trying to figure out how we tackle or deal with the environmental crisis. Now, okay, all good and well, I can almost hear people think, except, with these digital media, unfortunately, often you can't. but almost. And what about actual people in actual places struggling to make a living, right, as environmental crises unfold? Particularly those people that bear little responsibility for the crisis we are in. How to deal with this vicious circle when you have been dispossessed from a protected area, for example, to make way for rhinos. So power is not just structural, it is also shifting sand. It also depends. And hence, again, we're back at the central steps, center question. How is talk of crisis shaping nature and people's views of it? So for one, it depends on how it intersects with race, class, gender, age, and much more. And this is, however, precisely my point when I speak about the truth about nature. So let me just briefly illustrate this by digging a little bit deeper into the rhino poaching crisis in South Africa that I've been studying over the last couple of years. From 28 onwards, the number of rhinos that were brutally poached in South Africa skyrocketed very quickly to over 1,000 rhinos annually for several years between 2013 and 2015. I was actually in the Kruger National Park doing research quite often during this time, and I remember well some of the conversations I had with different people. Let me just highlight two. So one of them, a local leader from the communities neighboring the Kruger Park, a black man in his 50s who works at a local community-based organization called Plow Back to the Communities, told me in a conversation that, quote, people are very much concerned about the rhino poaching, but they have a lack of information. And they see this as something for a white person. So that is the message that Plowback should forward. The poaching of animals, most people don't really care about, as they don't really see any benefit from the wildlife. For most people, it doesn't concern them. So as Plowback, we wanted to start a project where we will have a forum as a liaison between Plowback, the village, and the reserves, end quote. So his goal was to find a way to open up communication between local Black communities and park management in order to talk about historical dispossession, brutal contexts of poverty, and how many local people look at this particular form of nature that was supposed to be in crisis. So I admire his dedication and call for diplomacy. But it was also really painfully clear at the time when I was doing these kind of interviews in my research, how this was so different from how many other people look at the problem. So for example, in a conversation with a white woman from South Africa, who was very active on several online forums around the Kruger Park and in relation to the rhino poaching crisis, when I asked her similar things, she first related her connection to the Kruger National Park. Quote, "The first time I came to the Kruger, it just spoke to me. I fell in love with the Kruger Park, and that was 1992. I bought every single book, every single article in magazines on Kruger, just so that I could read through it. And so it started for me with a passion for Kruger. To me, it was a romantic thing, how they managed the park and all. Then came Africam, a camera that emits straight from the bush 24/7. And I looked at the two cams every day to get my fix. And every time I wanted to get back to Kruger. So at this point in my interview, her husband sort of shouts in between, her passion dominates our lives. And she laughs and says, yeah, 90% of our conversations are about Kruger, and the other 10 are about our grandchildren, end quote. Now, this woman is not an exception. There are many like her on various forms of social media, a great majority of them white, particularly in a lot of forums around the Kruger National Park. And they're very, very passionate about the Kruger, and also very passionate about the rhino poaching crisis. But this respondent in particular noted, because she also had a more formal role, sort of managing these fora, how some people cannot really control their passions when it comes to the rhino poaching crisis, and indeed become very racist online, and that she needed to remove them from the site. So in other words, these people respond very differently to the crisis than the Black gentleman I talked about earlier. And just by highlighting these two stories, I've barely begun to touch the surface of the complexities of how different people relate to this particular environmental crisis in this particular place. But the broader point for me is that the histories, contexts, and different positionalities that infuse the messiness of daily lived life are part and parcel of any truth about nature. So in other words, you cannot discuss environmental crisis in South Africa and not talk about dispossession, racial difference, gender, class, and much more. So basically what I've done in these last couple of minutes is to make a case for power as both solid rock, where truth relates to structural forces that transcend daily realities, and power as shifting sand, where precisely it emphasizes the messiness, the it depends. So the question now is how to bring these two together. So this is where I get a little bit more into the abstract philosophical part of the book, where the key takeaway is that truth is always power, but also more than power at the same time. And I refer to this as a metaphysics of truth tensions. So it goes too far to explain here what I mean with it in any depth, but I believe there's one straightforward comparison that can help to illustrate, which at the same time also explains the fourth element, the politics of the relation between truth, power, and nature. And this is the difference between speaking truth to power and speaking fact to power. Now, the latter doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. But why not? Because facts are isolated pieces of information that may or may not be true, or that are actually true outside of context, history, and positionality. Right? So speaking truth to power is about saying something that transcends the it depends, but does take into account history, context, and positionality. So this is much more difficult. It's much more difficult to speak truth to power than speaking fact to power. It's much more difficult, it's much more sophisticated, and if done well, also much more effective. You can shout facts at power all day long, but it only has very little effect. But speaking truth to power shows power to be naked, like the famous emperor who had no clothes. Now, there's of course one problem still outstanding, the problem of platform capitalism, and how platform capitalism turns all of this inside out. So remember that under platform capitalism, any truth or lie could potentially be as profitable or as any other truth or lie. And this is literally what makes it beyond truth. And that this is the source of its power, which is, how I understand post-truth. It's never very hard to come to, let alone communicate any nuanced analysis in between the truth about nature and it depends on platforms or under a context of platform capitalism. Hence my plea that we cannot solve any environmental crisis if we also do not confront the power of this new emperor. But especially with this post-truth emperor, if we are to confront its power, we have to be able to say something truthful about it. And acknowledging this very point already helps to start stripping the new emperor, and hence why I wanted this to be my main point here today. So after stating this, let me just wrap up and briefly conclude. So the truth about nature is of course a weird and perhaps even arrogant title for a book, for any book. But I chose it deliberately to get myself and all of us to think about how to render truth productive. Foucault, of course, very famously argued that power is not just negative, but it can be positive and productive, that it does something in the world. So what if truth could be equally productive? What if it can be positive in the meaning that Foucault ascribed to it, that it can facilitate and not just repress, that it can afford and that it could provide meaning, and that indeed it can do all of these things at the same time, which I've tried to capture by developing a metaphysics of truth tension. Now, the single best way to make truth productive and positive is by speaking it to power, right? By making explicit how understanding that which takes into account context, history, and positionality, but still transcends the it depends, aims to make a difference. It is this act that makes us realize and see that structural change is possible. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Bram. It's really fascinating. I can't wait to get my hands on the book so I can read past the introduction. Just a moment before I pass the screen on to our next speaker, I just do want to say, if you have any questions or comments that you don't want to forget or just itching to get out, please do enter them in the chat box, and we'll be keeping track of everything for the roundtables part of the session. Okay, so without delay, I would like to welcome Elizabeth Havis, who is our first discussant today. Could you please just introduce yourself and, yeah, make yourself at home?
Thank you. How convenient, because I am at home.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Thanks so much. I'm Elizabeth Havis. Thank you, Bram, so much for inviting me to this exciting book launch and to the Step Center for this series. I wish I had been in on more of the series this semester. It sounds fantastic. So thanks for coordinating the event. And Bram, congratulations on your book and the book launch. And also Bram mentioned that the book arrived in his hands physically today. So that's really exciting to see. So it was a pleasure to read this short introduction to the book, and also then to hear, Bram, your broader context here today. And there's so much to think about here. So it was a pleasure to read and ponder, and I can't wait to read the rest. I was really drawn in right away to the introduction, in that Bram posed a really interesting puzzle that hooks the reader in right away, which is asking the question of, why do, let's call them environmentalists, continue to push this fact-based approach to their work in what is broadly understood to be a post-truth world? So why do they keep relying on facts and truth, despite knowing that it's unlikely to generate the kind of political action in this world where we're drowning in questions of information and misinformation? So that's a really interesting and compelling hook in, but really just an entry point to this much broader and much more complex set of dynamics that it looks like the rest of the book pulls apart to explain the contemporary forms of power in the world and their imbrication with questions of the environment and environmental crises. So I'm really excited about these intersections that they relate to my work as well. Oh, and I was supposed to introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Havis. I'm an associate professor in the geography department at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And presently I'm working on the intersections between big data, new data, and forms of environmental governance. So there was a lot for me to think about here. And so this fall in my graduate seminar in ontological politics, we revisited Latour. So of course I was curious about how this book would engage with some of these sacred topics of science study. And I can see the way they're skirting around the edges of these. And I read resonance with Latour's efforts to work really hard to clarify that his field is not arguing that facts or science are socially constructed. So Bram, I think that your context about facts being both concrete and real and operating in shifting stands is really useful here. And what Latour's efforts to clarify that his field is not arguing that facts or science are socially constructed is doing is in part arguing that science studies is concerned with the notion that social constructivism means that we replace what reality is made of with some other stuff upon which the social is really built, right? And so this is getting at some of these intersections that you're piecing apart. And the notion of disputing the linear trajectory. Can facts lead to action? And more broadly, instead, asking the question of how are things that are both social and natural associated? And calling for this potential to free facts from their sort of cage of truth in order to argue that matters of fact don't necessarily describe the agencies and associations that create forms of contemporary power. Their facts are complex, they're elaborated, they're collective, and that if broadly we move away from attention to facts towards matters of concern, that this can help to break the natural and social divide, which is, I think, where Bram's broader argument here about power and the differentiated ways that power acts in the world is so compelling and important. So I think that this perhaps helps us to navigate the complex way that Bram is asking us to examine truth and it's other, it's opposite, or maybe it's bedfellow post-truth, which is as an expression of power that manifests in the relationships among platform or surveillance capitalism, nature, and truth or post-truth. And to think about this as a pressing matter of concern. So I was really taken to, in the introduction, the way that platforms and platform capitalisms are so central because of the way that their success is not linked to the claim or the truth of the claim at all, but to its reproduction and recirculation. So we can see the links then to capitalism really closely. And I took some time to try to map out this. In the introduction, Bram outlines and discusses this vicious cycle of a vicious cycle. And I took some time to really try to map this out. What is the vicious cycle? It's a sort of existing structural political economy dynamics that not only drive, but are dependent on environmental degradation for their reproduction. So where does fact and then platform capitalism that depends on, for its own reproduction, the circulation of information, fit within that vicious cycle? So I think that there's a huge contribution here in terms of situating platform capitalism as a concrete entry point for helping to conceptualize why facts cannot lead to political action. And instead, these become sites of association of capitalist relations. So I'll be really interested to see later in the book the way that Bram pulls this apart. But I was taken by the notion that the goal is not to share truth or information, but to create data that is capitalizable. And I would also note that this involves securing advertising revenue, right? So that link of not what makes data commodifiable has to do with the sale of advertising revenue, which is how all of these platforms have any sense of profit. And of course, advertising then reproduces the power of both the technology firms and the forms of the consumption-driven political economy that environmentalists are perhaps trying to address in the first instance. So several things just captured my imagination and led me to want to read on. I really want to ask this question about how central platform capitalism is to this vicious cycle. Does the claim follow that if truth could be circulated in a different kind of way, would it have a new relationship to the structural dynamics of power that are underwriting the environmental crisis? Would there be a different kind of relationship to understandings of nature, to the environment, and to political economy? So if in political terms, is there a distinction between facts and claims about facts? What sites other than platforms are the places of negotiation about truth? And what is the distinction between the facts themselves and the places and sites, the sort of technologies that provide new sorts of facts, and the places and sites where these circulate? So I was attentive to the fact that there are relationships here that are not just relevant to new platforms, but also to new data and new ways of knowing our world that are thriving. And I know Max is also working in this area. So is the truth of any use at this point in time? And I think that this gets at some of the truth tensions that Bram is interested in, because on the one hand, we're in this post-truth world. On the other hand, we're seeing an elaboration and a sort of techno-optimism that we can know the truth about the world, about nature, about the environment, about human impacts and relationships to the environment in ways that we've never been able to know before because of new technologies, new data processing possibilities, artificial intelligence, and the like. So yes, I was taken then by the potential for truth and the truth about nature to connect to larger efforts in political economy and political ecology to theorize the environment as constitutive of and integral to society and economy and to a broader social order. So there's a really compelling dovetailing here to work on world ecology, for instance, including the potential to examine the truth about nature as always unstable, to situate the environment not as something that's separate from society, and also to do the work of addressing these differential positionalities and experiences of people and places around the world. So I think all of that is really exciting. And I also just have to note that there's a kind of deepening that echoes the cycles of political economy that political ecologists have long been interested in. Last week, I read about a new effort called Assuring Trustworthy AI, a collaboration between the World Economic Forum, an organization called AI Global, and the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto, that is trying to, for the first time, develop an independent global certification mark for the responsible use of AI systems. So we're seeing a sort of eco-certification of these forms of AI and knowledge circulation that are efforts, I think, to address the quandary of the post-truth world, but at the same time are doing the same sort of reproduction that we've seen through eco-certification as efforts to try to correct the problems of capitalism, but that sort of deepen their logics at the same time. So yeah, thank you, Bram, for a really compelling introduction. I hope that those comments are of some use for sparking conversation. And I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on the book to be able to read the rest. So let me turn it over to Max from there.
Thanks.
Awesome.
All right, Max, would you like to go ahead and just start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Max Ritts, and I'm a postdoc at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. I'm also a geographer, and I've been following Bram's work for a number of years, so it's really great to be here. And thanks to you, Amber, and also to Nathan, and of course to Elizabeth too, for those really helpful comments. So I'm going to offer a few similar comments and also some prompts that I was thinking about as I read the introduction in the first chapter, which I also really enjoyed. So as I was preparing for this talk, my partner told me that there was an interesting statistic out there, which is that 86% of 15-year-olds in America are unable to distinguish between fact and opinion now. So they do these studies, they do these categorization tests where they have statements and they ask the student to put them in the bin of either fact or opinion, and only 15% or so can actually get this done correctly. And this seemed really distressing until I also found out online that it's actually even worse with older people. So apparently young people are doing better than people over the age of 70 in this exact same exercise. And I think this is also, to speak to what's called digital literacy of younger generations. But when you put those two statements together, I think you come to realize that there's kind of layers of confusion around this relation of truth and opinion and post-truth. And these kinds of confusions, I really recommend books like this, which are taking those dynamics and debates and setting them to some of the most critical issues of the day, namely environmental crisis. And I think what struck me right away with this book is Bram really has a strong attention to the role and the question of the environmentalist movement in connection to this quandary, where the internet's radical deterritorialization of the social and with it collective knowledges and understandings has really kind of caught a lot of people in the movement by surprise, because as he stated earlier on here, there really is this conviction that we have the facts, that we know that the situation of nature is dire enough that if we just get the facts out there with enough graphics alongside them in the websites, perhaps, then we'll reach our audiences and people will want to join up with our movements. And of course, this is not working out quite the way people would want. And only the last year or two with election politics can prove that point. So I think what Bram's doing, in other words, is he's suggesting that environmentalists have misrecognized the nature of the truth-power relation, but also that they've misrecognized the power of the truth-nature relation. And I liked what he said at the end there about this formulation of speaking truth to power in a certain way as a kind of contribution to resolving these questions. And I'll go to that at the end of my little spiel here. So yeah, I think another key intervention of the book, which I'm excited to learn more about and talk more about, is to locate a significant sort of site for these epistemological concerns around nature, environmental movements, capitalism, and so forth, and that's the platform. And as I was thinking about this question, I was going back to some earlier texts which have done some similar theorizing around what Jodi Dean calls communicative capitalism, or what she did in her 2009 book, Neoliberalism and or rather Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies. And I bring that book up because there are similar questions in that book around the circulating content on the internet and the ability to provide personal input, and the ways in which the internet kind of exacerbates a self-ameliorating or self-aggrandizing tendency under capitalism, which does little to actually create democratic sites of debate and discussion, and actually leads us down all sorts of dangerous roads towards social antagonisms and fighting, and also denialism of science. So that book was written in 2009, and what's interesting about that book compared to what's happening now is there's really, I think, an unclear sense of where the concern ought to lie. With Dean's book, there's a very diffusive communicative capitalism. And what we have in Bram's book, but also in some works that he's claiming as inspiring his book, is a very definitive site through which to kind of analyze and prompt these questions. And that is, of course, the platform. And the platform is the central kind of analytic of capitalism in this book. And I think that's really important, even if it isn't the full story, because I think what it does is it gives environmentalists and other people a site to kind of, bring their critical attention to some sort of collective effort. And this isn't a move that's unique to Bram's work. I think other, projects in environmental thought and critique are also doing something similar. Andreas Malm has some new work in this regard. And even science fiction writers like Kim Stanley Robinson are exploring the likelihood that as the situation worsens under the climate, you will begin to see environmental movements take a more definitive stand toward, highlighting the specific, polluters, the oil executives and so forth. So I think this is an important strategic question, but it's also, a way of thinking the problem in more concrete terms, as Elizabeth also suggested. So, yeah. I like what was said about the truth to power question. I think it reminds me a little bit of what Gramsci describes in terms of objectivity, where he describes objectivity as a sort of universal subjectivity. And here universal doesn't mean everything the same everywhere, but rather that there is this attempt to kind of broaden the social truth of things through collective effort. And I think that's what Bram was getting to toward the end of his talk there. It's just this notion of truth as including the history and the sightedness of locations of environmental change, of including the dynamics that are quote unquote extra economic, such as racial and gender dynamics, and really pursuing a process-based approach to truth in which there is a collective effort. And that to me is a very Gramscian move. And that to me is also very compelling because of that, because I think that Gramsci offers political ecologists and other environmental thinkers some really concrete tools through which to imagine a kind of counter-hegemonic bloc that could both be full of difference, social difference, but also geared toward the same kind of objective, which in this case is overturning a certain epistemological regime, which is undercutting our ability to provide better environmental futures. So I really have two prompts that I want to just sort of leave my little talk here with, in the hopes that they'll be picked up by other people, including Bram and Elizabeth, perhaps. And they're just things that I was thinking about as I was reading the first two chapters. And I've also read the Rhino chapter, which I think is published already separately. So just from my grasp of the book so far, two things that I would like to hear more about. One is this sort of moral philosophical aspect of what's going on here. And the second is a question of education. So in terms of the moral philosophical, I was recently reading Wendy Brown's new book. And she doesn't talk a lot about environmentalism or digital platforms or even, the crisis of nature per se, but she does offer a really important site through which to think of post-truth politics, and that is the rise of nihilism in a kind of contemporary American sphere. And here she reads, Nietzsche, who talks about nihilism in terms of the devaluation of values, looking at how convergence of crises in America centered on neoliberalism for her have really created this powerful moral philosophical outlook which attaches itself to truth and which devalues the search for truth as a necessary basis for democracy. And I think there's a lot of potential to think about this project alongside that, because what the platform effectively does is I think commit to this devaluation of values through its kind of ascendancy of exchange value over use value in this case, but really look at the ways in which moral sentiments and affects attach themselves to the post-truth quandary. I think that's an important site to sort of carry some of these questions forward. And the other one is education, because I think Bram's subject position is as clearly as an environmental thinker here, as a person who wants to see a better world happen, but also as an educator. He's someone who is in a classroom, which strikes me as an important site to think about this moment of post-truth, because of course the classroom is a place where we can witness the effects of the post-truth regime in the way students compare facts and opinions in the way they do their research and the way we do our research as academics. I shouldn't limit it to students. There is a moment in which platform capitalism has entered the academic realm, and not always in a good way. But of course, the classroom is also a site for challenging this post-truth regime, for devising better ways of thinking about nature collectively. And I'm sure that Bram has done that in his classroom, where he's sought to instill within students a sense of the necessity to search for truth in a very confusing geopolitical moment. So I would be really curious to hear how the crisis of education, the neoliberalization of education, has also informed both the post-truth moment, but also Bram's project here as a political thinker and as someone who wants to see a better world.
Thanks so much. Bram, would you like to respond to either of our discussants before we move into the roundtable?
Well, first of all, just to say thank you so much to both Elizabeth and Max for these incredibly thoughtful comments, but also taking the time to go through the chapters. I was sorry that the book wasn't available yet. But I think you've grasped, and pointed towards a lot of things that indeed I've been sort of grappling with, and I think in one way or another, but certainly not all, right, come back in the book in different parts, and other points not that are really, and all of them are really inspiring to think through. So let me just pick out a couple of things just to kind of bounce back to you, perhaps, or and maybe pose some questions back to get the discussion going, but also maybe just to see if I understand things correctly. Starting with you, your points, Elizabeth, and also talking about the vicious cycle and how central, if I understand you correctly, how central is platform capitalism in all that, right? What other sites outside of platform capitalism are places where facts get discussed, where matters of concern become political reality for different kind of actors, which I do think actually connects quite nicely to the point that Max was making in terms of his point about the platform being a central site, right? Something that you can direct critique to, even though it's also a very amorphous site, of course. I mean, the platform, the way I see it, and maybe that's also good to clarify here, the platform, in terms of platform capitalism, is something that I see as an intersection, an online intersection that in one way or another becomes the space that people need to go through in order to get from A to B, very simply put, right? But if you want to, so with Google, if you want to know something, you type Google and you search for things. If you want to go anywhere, Google Maps. If you want to see how many citations you have as an academic, you go to Google Scholar. There's a Google for everything, but you go through Google. You go through the online platform and you leave data behind. Now it's become way more amorphous than that, obviously. And one of the key elements there is, for example, Facebook's like signal, right? Because they have allowed other sites to include these like buttons, so that when you actually press on the like button on any other site, the signal goes back to the platform, owned by Facebook, and they can collect data about you. So these are other scholars who have pointed it out, right? The platform is both a way to decentralize and re-centralize the internet, right? Information on the internet, and hence bring it back to those who actually control the biggest infrastructure online in order to be able to extract rent data from it. And as Elizabeth says, right, sell the data to advertisers and to others, including, political parties these days and what have you, right? Cambridge Analytica, to pursue their objectives and allow people, if they enter this amorphous, cloud, this platform cloud, that your search results or things will come on top. So that is already quite a complex site. But I think, Elizabeth, you make a very important point. It's not the only site. I think so. I would literally hold that it's become such an important site that it has changed capitalist power in one way or another, dramatically over the last 20 years. So I do hold that. I do make that assertion. At the same time, as I mentioned in my introduction, there are certain longer-standing historical elements of capitalism that have gone on for much, much longer, obviously, and that that morph into this new form through which it takes shape. But here is where environmentalism is important, I think. Here's where environmentalism makes a difference. So Nick Srnicek, who wrote this really, really great book on platform capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote now the Bible on surveillance capitalism. It's as thick, but also an amazing, amazing work. I mean, just absolutely phenomenal. But they only touch so much on environmental issues, right? It's sort of sideways for them. But the key for environmental actors is, of course, that environmental impact is not ultimately made online, right? So, and particularly for conservationists, if you want to save a dolphin, if you want to save an elephant, right? All of a sudden, the distinction between offline and online comes to matter. And here is, I think, where my book directly challenges some of the STS crowds in a certain way, where there's been a consistent theme that they've been saying, and it's somewhat Latourian in a certain sense, but it is part of the sort of broader processional, relational sort of trend, whereby you emphasize the relational, above differentiation in many ways, right? I mean, I'm not saying that relational scholars discount the fact that there are differences and all that, but the relational gets the more emphasis. But obviously, this is a pretty hard line here, right? To conserve an offline elephant and an online elephant is rather different. So here it does indeed become very crucial how indeed facts, concerns, truths, and all these other things come to be negotiated by actors in these offline spaces. And at the same time, how online spaces, online platforms come to change and transform them in fascinating, interesting, and sometimes really disturbing ways. So this is how I've basically also set up the book, right? So part 2 of the book, the 2 chapters there really sort of expound on this vicious circle in order to outline the political economy of platform capitalism and how that affects our understanding of sharing nature, of sharing more generally, but sharing natures and truths about nature and all that. And there I make the case for that vicious circle, for how and why power has changed. But then there's 4 chapters, so 2 times as many, on offline spaces, or actually the connections between them, and how in different ways both both the relational between the offline and the online comes to matter, and how that's negotiated by environmental actors, right? So, and or not negotiated. So, some don't actually have to negotiate it. They can, in one way or another, live in a completely online world, and whatever that happens on the ground, whether that had any relation to what's happening on the ground, doesn't seem to matter. So there's one chapter that actually makes that point, where I was surprised, right? Where Dutch do-gooders started crowdsourcing for an elephant corridor between Botswana and Zambia that didn't exist, and that literally could not exist because people there did not want elephants, running around their villages and all that, which, I mean, I guess most of us would agree with. I mean, that elephants are, in case people are wondering, they're pretty big and can be quite destructive. So, right? It's quite a big thing to have an offline elephant run through your garden. So it comes to matter in a very, very real and interesting way. And at the same time, there's another chapter, for example, on Kruger, on the Kruger National Park, and how new mechanisms, online mechanisms, come to change how we think about interacting with the natures in the park. And one of my central arguments there is that the new ways in which the relational takes shape actually enlarges hierarchies and differences, because whites are so much. Let me just try to put it as straightforward and clear as possible. Because whites spend so much more time around the Kruger online, and because the Kruger Park itself due to its earlier neoliberalization and the fact that it's dependent on income from these same, overwhelmingly white tourists, right, really respond to what's happening online, they are able to circulate ideas about nature in the park in a way that no longer does justice to, the social environment around the park, including people that have earlier been dispossessed, that still have a claim, the intricacies of rhino poaching in the park and all that. So my argument there is that as these boundaries between the park and the outside are transgressed through social media, it also at the same time starkens and reinforces the hierarchies that these very boundaries depend on. And so you get, I think, a very interesting sort of dialectic between the relational and between various forms of hierarchies. So I just wanted to highlight that particular part in response to a couple of the things that you were saying, Elizabeth, and then maybe sort of switch to the point that you were making, Max, about the moral philosophical element and your point about education. I think you talk about Wendy Brown's book, where she says that the critique of neoliberalism hasn't taken into account the moral dimensions of Hayek and how they're thinking about their projects, right? And indeed, how nihilism is. And so, I've actually been reading a book by a famous Dutch conservative recently, and he talks about exactly these same things. And he says he actually, one of the arguments that he's making is that nihilism is much longer sort of intellectual heritage before Nietzsche. And one of the key elements in that is a particular form of anti-essentialism, that indeed by moving away from classical understandings of the world, which focus on a particular form of essentialism, right? And focused on what we share in common, whereby, our modern sort of ideas about difference and that all of us are unique individuals who need to be acknowledged as unique individuals are quite different from how, arts and sciences and understandings work before, how all of us are basically variations on a theme whereby there's an essence of the human, whereby there's an essence of particular animals or ways of doing. And that essence has been let go, right? Because of, it goes too long to talk about the history of the philosophy of the Enlightenment here and the romanticist critiques on the Enlightenment. But that's where he says a lot of this stuff comes from. And that really made me think about indeed how under platform capitalism that gets to be exploited in all kinds of new ways. Because my understanding of truth in the end plays with the relation between, again, essentialism and non-essentialism, between relationism and between more structural forces, and how we need to acknowledge both at the same time. Because I don't think we need to go back and want to go back to these classical understandings. I think they're highly problematic. But the one thing that some of these more conservative philosophers argue, and that Wendy Brown actually does a fantastic job of really bringing to the fore, and that I think progressives have really neglected at their peril. So, I think I really thank you for bringing that up, is to include the moral element of that and how that allows us to think about things we have in common, right? And this comes back to the progressive idea, right, and to our understandings of education. But in practice, we have so little to stand on if we constantly press individualism, difference, and all those things above and beyond, also at the same time trying to understand what transcends them to make, the common possible, and to make, ideas about, truth possible, right? How things can be more than it depends, at the same time. So that, I think is really part and parcel of some of the stuff I'm trying to get to, and what I think is important for education in the broadest sense of the term. Let me just leave it at that, because but again, thank you both. There's much more to be said about this, but wow, thank you so much for bringing up these incredible points.
Thanks. I think we're going to move into the roundtable section of our event today. We've had one question presented in the chat. It's from Eric Meyer, and I will just allow Eric to ask their question themselves.
Hello, can one hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, hello everybody. Hello, thanks for the talk. First of all, my question was related to basically the beginning of your talk and the critical point you made, how platform capitalism basically undercuts any idea of, okay, these are facts, these are fake news and so on, and that's all about, okay, basically, okay, how can this data basically be transformed into exchange value? And I don't know if I misunderstood you there, but it seemed to be that you made a point, okay, that because of that, these platforms are basically useless territory for environmental struggles. I don't know if you made this strong point, but if you do, or if anybody would make this point, I would contest, okay, but why is truth in strategic struggle important? Can we always use simplifications in political struggle and so on, but why not engage in the game of post-truth? It's too serious to say, okay, no, we don't engage in this, we are purists. Yeah, I think this is generally a big question of how lies can be instrumentalized in the struggle. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I mean, I think that is a really important point. And my argument is not that platforms are useless. So in fact, the first of those 4 more empirical sort of messy daily life chapters, the first one is about environmental organizations, to make 2 points, basically. The first, that they are not victims of platform capitalism, right? They study it, they use it, they abuse it, they get into it. Many of them understand the downsides of it in various ways, right? Some even more philosophical, but some also very practical. And they devise a politics of platforms, as I call the chapter, to deal with it. So that's the one point. The other point is that they do indeed achieve things in real life through and with these platforms. Absolutely, they do, right? So I actually show, for example, that Greenpeace and WWF have been very, very effective in mobilizing digital social media tools to pressure the Brazilian government to defeat a particular bill that would extend, logging in the Amazon. And so I actually go into a little bit of detail here, because this example was related to me in an interview that I had with one of these big environmental organizations. And then I came home and got an email from the other organization, I think Greenpeace, about this very same campaign. So I started getting into this, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And they coordinated all of this through Facebook, and also through what they called the Facebook Friend Finder. So I got this email asking me if they could install a little app on my Facebook, because they weren't interested in my opinion, but they were interested in me, my Brazilian friends, so that through me they could get to more Brazilians to coordinate and mobilize, Brazilian pressure onto then Dilma Rousseff. So I thought this was fabulous, right? This was fantastic. And another example I have is for example from Indonesia, where also on local court cases, environmental organizations kept the pressure up through social media in order to make sure that judges wouldn't be corrupted in the game between palm oil plantation owners and activists and all that. So they said we just kept hammering them on Facebook, boom, 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 on Twitter, boom, on whatever, and it has effects, right? It has effects. So I think in relation to your point, environmental organizations are playing the game. They are already playing the game. They're over their head in all of this. But what I'm at the same time trying to do is that as they're playing that game and sometimes winning or losing strategic battles, there is a much bigger battle going on here that I think is important to acknowledge. And this is the battle about whether or not, you know, an idea of truth, right, matters in the end or not. So in the beginning of chapter 1, I actually make a difference between truth tensions, the way I sort of theorize the relation between these sort of different understandings and epistemological positions on truth, and truth wars. So there's a book on truth wars, and here it becomes pure power, right? So if we let these things up, if we let things that we hold, you know, that we care deeply about, if we just only think of them as truth wars, as power wars, and it's only about power, then there is no more moral high ground or ground anywhere. Then it only becomes a power game where you need to accumulate as much power as you can in order to play that power game. But what truth allows you to do, and I take this from Arendt, from Hannah Arendt's ideas of understanding, is it allows you to acknowledge power, but at the same time transcend it in a way that makes power naked. And it allows people to see beyond what is currently dominant as power, and why we perhaps need to transcend, you know, move beyond that, and why, you know, change is possible and how it becomes possible. And that is at the same time always important as this power game. I'm not saying we shouldn't play that power game. I'm not even saying that we should all en masse go off of social media or anything, but I am saying that we need to tackle the power structures behind current social media platforms in order to have a more realistic chance and a better way to perhaps organize this power game.
Thanks. I actually have a question, and if anybody else has questions, please just enter them in the chat, and we'll call on you. Yeah, but I have a question that relates to this idea of alternative facts, and really thinking about political ecology. You know, the truth and facts about nature have always been deployed in ways that are, you know, really contested, and particularly, you know, the way that you know, facts are presented and generalized in particular ways to support particular truths and power arrangements. I'm wondering what you think, you know, kind of broadening out a bit, how are the sorts of facts that are associated with post-truth power contests similar to or different from the sorts of contested truths and facts that we've long dealt with in political ecology? You know, tropes around degradation, you know, population explosion, you know, the way that information is used to imply and shift blame to the people with the least power, you know, like, yeah, so I'm just wondering if you see kind of the structure and content of these messages changing, or is it relatively the same in terms of what the content is?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, well, thanks, Amber, for a very good and thoughtful question. This is something that I think I need to think about a little bit more, perhaps in particular in relation to the literature, including, of course, by Melissa and others, right, on environmental degradation and all that. So for me, what separates this kind of epistemological politics, you know, from older days and from, you know, or historically more generally, is that I link post-truth deliberately to platform capitalism and the emergence of platform capitalism, right? So for me, post-truth is not the same as lying or bullshitting or those kind of things. And this is where I have a bit of a beef with STS and some others. And so I tried to lay it out in the first chapter after the introduction, how many of them, you know, try to wriggle their way out of, you know, the constructionist sort of, you know, direction but you know, we shouldn't be going too far. But then how do you deal with all of this? And I think for me it's quite logical in a certain sense. I mean, is to really make a difference between, or conceptually between, these different terms, right? So lies and lying, and alternative facts and ideas about, or how you, if you interpret that in that kind of way, is about knowing that something else is different, knowing the truth, but deliberately saying something else in order to deflect from the truth. That's so. Harry Frankfurt wrote a book called On Bullshit, where a tiny little book where he said bullshit is different from lying, because here actors don't actually care whether it's truth or false, right? It's about getting attention. It's about, you know, and bullshit has also always been there. So for me, post-truth is literally beyond it. And it's really tied to the functionality of algorithms that literally do not care, right? In terms of how they're functioning and how they are, in terms of whether something is true or not. So that's why Facebook needs to hire 20 or 30,000 people to start fact-checking things, you know, whether things are actually true. So all of these, and I think what you're mentioning, actually become intertwined in this new age, because it's not like the elements that you talk about, right? Discussions about, you know, environmental degradation, how we come to see that, and how they're constructed in various ways for particular political purposes, you know, all of a sudden have stopped happening in this age. No, that continues and gets intermixed with, I think, this new form of power. And that makes it a little bit more tricky. But at the same time, by separating lies, bullshit, and post-truth, you know, hopefully more clearly, we can also start to, you know, see where we need to intervene and or critique in order to rectify some of this, or in order to come to a good political ecology critique of these kind of things.
And to see then their relationship to these structural relationship to how facts get placed within capitalism, right? Not just that. Yes.
Yeah. What made me think about that really was this idea that, not departing from what you're saying at all, but the fact that some of these, like depending on the content, there can be a lot more traction, and I'm wondering, or shareability or whatever. So yeah, I'm wondering if that matters to the algorithm, but I guess.
Oh, for sure, because one of the things, of course, that platform capitalism allows is trending. So, right, it's a particular form of fleetingness, you know, a spectacularization of these particular forms of knowledge, right, whereby certain things are taken up because they're taken up, or because so many people are taking them up, right, and it becomes this kind of, you know, self-reinforcing thing that may or may not have anything particularly related to it, but again, why post-truth is different is because it is an expression of power, but also ways that the powerful can use it. And this is something I borrowed from somebody else, Mark. What's his name? I forget his name. Very interesting scholar, but he argues that the powerful have been able to use platform dynamics by deliberately flooding the information market with all kinds of things, such that it becomes harder and harder to. Yes, Mark Andreevich, thanks so much. thanks, Max. By flooding the information market in such a way that it becomes harder to distinguish anything at all, right? And hence, to protect yourself from this deluge of information, right, it's safer to go into a particular niche, and to stick within your in your niche, right? And so Mark calls that the nichification, or actually I think others have already talked to that about the nichification of online audiences, and we see that very clearly, you know, in US and other politics, of course, in Brexit and then what have you. So so that I think is different in a way, but it's not to say that there are no historical precedents. Right? It's always hard to say that something is completely, utterly new, and we need to be careful of that. Right? It morphs, it changes, but we need to, and that's why critical research is so important, to keep studying how this morphing happens, so that we keep on targeting our critique to where it actually matters, and how we can show certain emperors to be naked.
All right. We have questions from Rose and then Alice Bell. So Nathan, can you unmute Rose?
Hi, thanks for a really fascinating talk and responses and so on. Something that's been bubbling around in my head is this link between kind of truth, little kind of bubble making, these algorithms that create online bubbles wherever, in these echo chambers where people are all talking the same language, and these kind of contradictory certainties, and how this is related to people's identities. Just thinking about the growth of kind of conspiracy theory online, and it strikes me that this idea that you are part of a group, that it's a group identity through which this certainty comes about. And whether this is something new or whether it's just a kind of exaggeration of existing kind of group dynamics, I'm not sure. But what are the implications of these dynamics for action? I mean, you've said that you don't think we should all come offline, but it's sort of, that to me is the kind of knee-jerk response. It feels like, what's the saying about the master's tools not being able to dismantle the master's house? If we don't come offline, if we are constantly playing this game, are we kind of complicit? What are the forms of kind of social action and resistance to the processes that you talk about? Yeah. Sorry, it's a bit of a mishmash of questions in there, so apologies.
No, but I mean, wow, this is really fundamental. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether Elizabeth and Max have thoughts about this as well. I mean, it triggers a lot of thoughts with me, but please, I don't want to hog the floor. So
go ahead,
I mean,
Max.
I think it relates back to Eric's question, opening question, why is truth strategically important? You know, why don't we just engage in games of trying to attract allies for instrumental ends, you know, and then enlarge in these chambers and you know, beat the other chambers with our larger chambers. And I think the point was also brought up really well by Nancy Fraser in a recent talk she gave at Lund University, which is really that, you know, there is like a Gramscian moment here. This is about building an effective counter-hegemonic bloc. And in this case, you know, the bloc would have to consist of various different environmentalisms, of indigenous activists, of youth-driven protests in Scandinavia, of anti-coal activists in Germany, all sorts of things, all sorts of movements and concerns. And I think it's necessary to have a shared reality. So, you know, it's necessary to engage in spaces where opportunities for connection can be found and forged, while also recognizing the perils of those connections if they're led to be overly dependent on the initial systems of connection. So, I mean, I think that you know, that talk that Nancy Fraser gave, which is online, is a helpful way of kind of clarifying this with respect to the environmental movement writ large. But I also think that, you know, the site of the platform does serve one of those moments and opportunities, it seems.
Yeah, I think this also really links back to the prior comments from both Max and Bram about the question of nihilism and individualism, and sort of how we all become individual actors through the platform. Individual identity is so important to this kind of mode of being in the world and of being economic actors within the world. And so I think, yeah, this connects with Max's points here about, well, what is the theory of change? How do we envision what kinds of relationships between people, who's visible, who's absent in political struggles? What is the role of the state? Bram mentioned breaking up these monopolies. So is individual action enough to just say, no, I'm logging out of Twitter? no, patently the answer is no, right? And it links back, I think, to the structural questions about how the economy works and how individuals are reified within that system. And back to, these classic questions about how environmental change happens and the shift from collective action to individual actions, and what actions you take, what things you buy, what products you associate yourself with as the source of environmental change, as obviously being not only lacking, but deepening the capitalist relations that are driving the environmental problem in the first instance.
Yeah. So maybe just to add 2 sentences to this very, very briefly. I haven't studied the question of identity myself, but I think that's an absolutely critical and crucial point. And a lot in the book relates to or can be studied through that lens, and how different groups start to form, right? Literally from smaller groups in South Africa who sort of started reinforcing a very violent sort of racism in relation to the rhino poaching crisis, to bigger type of things, but also how this relates historically to other forms of identity offline and like within South African society more broadly. But it also, the bigger question I think you pose, Rose, is also in relation to the master's tools, right? Mm-hmm. Because technology, of course, is such a weird tool. I've been thinking about that a lot. I don't have an answer to the question, should we go to a time before this kind of technology? Is that at all relevant? Will it go away, or do you need to? So there, I just read this book called Zucht. Zucht. Yeah. Very funny, by Robert, or was it McNamee, a venture capitalist, who actually said we need to go a couple of steps back. We need to just undo some of these things. It's very funny, like, and I actually when he said that, I was like, yeah, maybe that's actually a good idea. But then it comes from this venture capitalist kind of guy who I don't trust in many other instances. But the book is highly interesting. But for me, two people actually that are more interesting to maybe go to in this respect are Max's former mentor and I think next future mentor, Karen Bucker, who is really sort of on the one hand really thinking through how to use technologies in environmental governance in new ways. She understands the critique, but is also in her way trying to see how it can or should be used. So I'm not so sure how far she's along with that Max. I've been privy to some of her thoughts and ideas on this, and I find it sort of really interesting, but also sometimes a little bit frightening. Whereas I think Jennifer Gabrice is also really thinking through these kind of elements in new kind of ways. And I think, both of their work would be really, really important to check, I think, in relation to the questions you pose. But maybe Max can say more about.
I think what both those people are really onto that's important is that there's a need for experimentation and for getting kind of messy with things as environmentalists, which is to say collaboration with tech designers, with technologists, with people on the ground who have questions that can't be asked on the ground, but collaboration with academics. So I know that both of them have collaborated with different kinds of actors, around environmental questions. And that's also a point raised again by Andreas Malm and other critical environmental thinkers here in Sweden. So I think, strategies that involve different kinds of tools are, really important. And maybe those are the kinds of tools that undo the master's tools because they're new and they're different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's...
Go ahead, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think that this is partially why I was asking the question about the place of platforms and then the other places where these new kinds of data, technologies, algorithms, and innovations can come together for change, because the natural scientists and data scientists that I work with are really struggling with these questions. And they're directly working with policymakers. They're working on conservation targets. They're forging new ground, and they know it's risky. And they know that they have new forms of information, but that they're incomplete, that they're partial, but that they're extremely powerful because of the way that they present they're able to present in new and compelling ways a form, something that can easily be taken as truth. And they don't know how to nuance their data, how to say, wait, no, we're not sure. And so they, personally are really, really struggling with that as well. And so I think it raises the importance of Bram's book and the need for collaborations and experimentation with natural scientists, data scientists, information scientists, and social scientists together to kind of wade through this terrain.
Yeah, I mean, I really full-heartedly agree. I think that's really well put. And at the same time, I mean, I think what's important, an earlier point that you mentioned, Elizabeth, is sort of really getting back to a critique of capitalism in all of this. And of course, we're not the only ones doing that, right? Mm-hmm. So I have been contacted more recently by, for example, landscape architects and architects and other technology entrepreneurs and all that, who actually have an incredibly refined critique of capitalism and are working through and with that. It's and of course that can go both ways. I mean, I see Holly Buck online here as well, and her work sort of outlines how some people actually recognize that capitalism will go fully nuts and crazy, and then you need to start doing geoengineering and all kinds of incredibly big and rather hectic technologies, and or in other ways deal with technology, art forms, design and other ways in order to do things differently. And that process is I think, as Max pointed out rightly, is messy. And we need to get into that messiness, but without also at the same time trying to hold on to some kind of backbone through which to understand some of these things and to transcend them in terms of a longer vision of where we want to go. And where what kind of world we actually want to build and mess towards.
Yeah, so I think that is a really hopeful way to talk about this, because it's about possibilities. I think it's really easy to focus on like the dystopian post-truth analytics, and maybe there also are spaces for politics and for possibilities and experimentation as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it takes us making that step, right? So for me, this book has always been part and parcel of two projects, and the other one came out earlier this year as a book called The Conservation Revolution, which is what the book says. It tries to envision another way to do conservation and to build. So literally the last section in The Truth About Nature is basically moving towards that other thing. It's moving from platform capitalism to post-capitalist platforms, right? Where we can use platform IDs, not necessarily online, but more broadly, to experiment with on the ground nitty-gritty messiness and ideas to do things differently, and at the same time relate that always to broader visions of a different world, of a better world. But in all of that, you need to be able to say something truthful, because otherwise, why would people in any way follow you, right? Even if we understand, of course, that all of this is political. Of course, it's political. Right, but in our politics, we can also strive for something understanding that transcends, the nitty-gritty of everyday life, and that puts us on a different path. Because if we don't have that anymore, we come back to the question of nihilism that Max rightly brought to the fore, I think.
Thanks. We have a question from Alice. Alice, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, my name's Alice. I am a former SDS academic, but I now have been for the last 5 years comms director of a green NGO, so I do this every day. It's lovely to be able to join a seminar like this and be able to listen to things in a slightly more abstract way. But it's something that I do actually talk about with colleagues in my own organisation and across the sector a lot. I think that the sorts of things that we were discussing earlier are very, very live conversations, and people are very reflective actors in terms of their response to this. And obviously they use different words, but it's certainly something they're talking about a lot. And one way in which I think a lot of these things have come together over the last year and has been a really live discussion, is continuing to be a bit of a sticky point for a lot of us, is how much money, particularly the larger green NGOs like Greenpeace and WWF that you mentioned earlier, are paying to Facebook for advertising. And there was this call to boycott Facebook earlier in the summer, which started through discussions more towards race and various different other issues. And the climate movement brought it up, saying, well, actually fake news is so core to so much of what we do, but also because environmental issues, it's important for a lot of green NGOs to intersect that with other live political issues. And it was just wrong for green NGOs to be paying money for that. So we saw 350, I think quite bravely, certainly seemed brave compared to some actors who were not talking about it, came out and said, we're part of this boycott, and encouraged other people in the sector to do that. And I would just be really interested to, so I know what all the comms people in NGOs think about it, but I'd be really interested to hear what you as a panel, if you have any reflections on that, whether you've watched it, either talk to actors who are actively participating in it, or just looking from the outside thinking, it seems like a naughty issue anyway. I thought it'd be one that it would be interesting to hear what you thought about.
Wow, I didn't know about that. That's incredible. That link that you sent, Alice. Thanks so much. Guys,
yeah,
what do you think, guys? Elizabeth?
I think it's super interesting. So I just happened to hear a radio program recently that was focusing on this question of this is actually what led me to raise the point about advertising in the introductory comments, which is kind of situating centrally the advertising economy as a part of the global economy, and positing that that there is actually an economic bubble of advertising. And the program I was listening to went back to a Berkeley economist who had been working with eBay, did a study to ask eBay. eBay wanted to know, like, are we getting anything out of the amount of money that we're spending on advertising? And through like a series of experiments, they found that that only a very small, there was a statistically insignificant value that was associated with the huge amount of money they were spending on advertising. So this raises a fundamental question about if there's advertising actually is not adding value for the companies that are spending huge budgets on advertising, then what happens actually to the cascading questions in the economy? If you think about all of the platforms, you think about the sports industry, you think about how much of our economy is premised on advertising. So it's really compelled by Bram's situating of the platform and of there's two moves, right? The first one is that truth doesn't matter. What matters is the algorithm that can commodify the information that people are interested in and want to share. But the second move is that commodification happens through advertising, through the ability to sell advertising, which is then connected to other forms of the real economy, including a massive part of our economy that is just structured on an advertising industry. So if you're to ask eBay, or you're to ask, any communications director or marketing director, what's the value of advertising? They're certainly not going to say like, oh, advertising doesn't add any value to our company, so my job, right, is irrelevant. We no longer need that portion of the economy. So I think it's a fundamental component of this broader dynamic of platform capitalism. Yeah. So Alice, that is super interesting. I also did not know about that campaign. But so what would happen to our economy if advertising was no longer a driving force for several of these, right? It's a huge question.
I'll just say something quickly. I think that was a great answer, and also it was a great question. Another thing about the book, about Bram's book, that's I think important is the engagement with Zuboff, because I think this is a book, right? The Rise of Surveillance Capitalism, that really gives us a lexicon through which to think about some of these questions. And I think Bram's book is one of the only books I know that's engaging that right now from a political ecology perspective. I'm trying to, but I haven't really gotten that far. But one of the concepts she brings up in that book is the uncontract, which is we sort of think about it in terms of the spatial access we have to certain areas with the key card. And once the subscription ends, you're radically kind of canceled from entering and exiting that space. So there's a spatial and there's a temporal dimension to it. And I think it's more than just, you know, a kind of a contractual thing. I think it's a larger kind of social ontological condition of this platform capitalist moment where, you know, what 350 is doing is delinking and kind of, you know, ending a relationship in a pretty profound way for it because of the advertising revenue. And it's also a way that platform capitalism works on people, right? It's also a way that it imposes violence on people by radically foreclosing their ability. They literally live in a space of post-truth where they're unable to access certain realities that they were able to before. So I just think that, you know, it's worth also reflecting on some of the ideas that are brought up in the book in relation to this question you brought up, Alice.
Yeah, and it makes that recent threat of that case against Facebook so much more relevant again, right? Where both Republicans and Democrats in the U.S., you know, see, because I mean, this only works if, and this is what Zuboff explains incredibly well. And in fact, yeah, Nick Sriniček also goes into this, but Zuboff really sort of gets to the heart of that, how platforms have this platform effect, right? The bigger they get, the more access they can get, the more valuable they become, even if they don't always give the kind of revenue that people expect to get from there through their advertising. Right? They're not always necessarily so accurate as they say that they are, even though they sometimes get frighteningly close. And these days, you don't even really have to have a Facebook profile anymore or whatever in order for them to have, right, this data double of you, right? They have data doubles of all of us, and they get 90% of those data from outside of things directly related to either Facebook or Google or whatever. So it also poses the question of the politics of visibility of commercial interests and of non-commercial interests, right? And maybe this is a question for me to Alice back, like, what's the pressure that environmental organizations feel in order to be visible, to be part and parcel of this, right? In that process, in order somehow to not miss out, right? Because this is the feeling I got from a lot of environmental organizations, including, like, for example, at the World Parks Congress, where the argument was, all young people are on there. The only way we can reach young people and many other people is if we are also on here, and hence we have no choice, right? We need to advertise on it. We need to hire companies like Trace Buzz that can, you know, trace the buzz, and then we can respond to it. And so, you know, one of the things I also talk about in one of the chapters is how it changes labor at you know, communications departments in environmental organizations, where now all of a sudden they had to work 24/7, because, you know, they realize that when people come out of work, they start looking at Twitter, Facebook, and going online more than they do during work, which they also do. But they needed to reach those people, and so at Greenpeace in the Netherlands, for example, people had weekend shifts. They had 3 weekends in a row where they were responsible for tracing the buzz online and responding to it from an organizational perspective. And they were getting a bit tired, you know, doing that. And I can imagine why. I believe, like, it's never ending, and it's this energetic bubble that you get sucked into. And the real winner, of course, is Facebook, because, you know, they will take advertising money from you guys, from environmental organizations, but they will at the same time take it from Shell and others. And all of that makes good money for them. So, yeah, I don't know, Alice. It's an incredible conundrum that I think so much of you guys are in. And I sympathize.
Yeah, Alice, can you give us any, like, kind of how that discussion has evolved in your field?
Sorry, I was dependent on being unmuted. Yeah, I guess I just very briefly, because I know there's lots of other questions. I think that there are various different pressures to be both active on Facebook and to be off it. My charity is running a campaign at the moment that's anti-advertising, which is a sort of larger extra challenge, as particularly speaks to what you were saying, Elizabeth. But specifically Facebook, I think there's lots of our supporters, for a reason, and I think this is true, probably more true of 350 and Greenpeace. You know, they will have key supporters who would say, I hate that I'm giving you money and you're giving it to Zuckerberg. But at the same time, people are saying, oh, you need to be on here. I think the thing about wanting to be where young people are is something that people often say, but actually when you're speaking to people who are working in digital mobilization, often, particularly Facebook, that's to get old people, to get rich old people to give you money. You know, and one of the challenges for digital mobilization groups and fundraising groups and charities is that they are going to have to think about where they work in Instagram and TikTok, and how Facebook will have to think about how they can offer products that will allow charities to fundraise on them.
Right, but
currently fundraising works with, Facebook works with fundraising, so it's not just a reach thing. I mean, it's a very complicated thing. And the thing you were talking about how much time and labor goes into it as well. Like, I mean, I really feel for people who moderate comments on Greenpeace and Facebook. You know, it's a bit like having to be monitoring comments on the BBC or something. You're having to read a lot of hate speech, and that's a really horrible thing. And that's something that NGOs are very aware of what they're having to give their staff, and how they're paying staff time to absorb this. Like, why are we using our charitable resources to be basically offering Facebook to be an entertainment place? But yeah, I mean, it's a complicated thing, and you've got many other questions, but thank you for addressing it.
Well, thank you for raising this. I think, yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's so interesting, really interesting.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and 2 outstanding questions. So I'm going to ask that DA and then Holly ask their questions or make their comments, and then whatever time we have left, you can compete to fill up with your responses. Okay, DA, would you like to start?
Hi, sorry, my name is Donya. I had a bit of a question that was also just a comment or a bit of food for thought, but basically I was just sort of wondering about the interesting resonances that this, coming back to the discussion that Bram brought up about the project of exposing the emperor as being naked, sort of speaking truth to power in order to kind of expose its limitations, its hypocrisies, etc. How closely that resonates with the ways that contemporary science denialists, especially conspiracies, actually present themselves. So I was wondering, I mean, it doesn't really mesh exactly with the idea of sort of letting everything go, letting, go of truth, and sort of, everything is mere politics and whatever. It's like, no, these groups actually really believe in their project of speaking truth to power, actually. And yeah, what does that mean for the analysis, I guess?
For those who don't know Donya, she's doing incredible work herself on science communication. We just had, so we know each other from quite a while back and just got reacquainted and had a wonderful conversation last week. And she's doing really good work on science communication in and around platforms and digital media. So, but thanks so much for this question, Donya. For me, the really short answer is, I think a thing that Latour comes back at in his book on his 2005 book on actor network theory is the relation between politics and knowledge, right? Between sort of advocacy and understanding. And I think conspiracists put the one in front of the other, and I think as critical researchers we should do the other way around. So, right, you put the way you abuse and use knowledge in order to confront power is driven by your politics in order to expose or to get to certain things. And of course, it relates to the other point that Rose mentioned earlier, then identities and bubbles and all that. But I think as critical researchers, we also have a responsibility to see where we are wrong, right? To interrogate our own biases, to formulate things in a way that it can also be challenged in another way. So for me, that would be a difference in terms of, it's still political, because everything is political, but it's not putting the political horse in front of the cart or behind, or how do you, anyway. So that's that's kind of my opinion on this, but maybe Max and Elizabeth have others, and Amber, other
can we let Holly ask her question too before before we run out of time?
Yeah, thanks for this. Sorry, I realized it might have been two questions in one. The first is just about withdrawal. Going to Rose's question, I was reading Ben Tarnoff's great essay in this issue of Logic about the Luddite option and how that is an essential option. But like, why don't we have a broader cultural movement about withdrawing from these platforms and creating the alternative? Why is it just this individual action? And then related to that is just there's something about the emotional component of engaging with these platforms, which I assume must be pretty prominent in environmental engagement. And I was wondering if the people you'd spoken to gave you thoughts about that, generally speaking. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Holly. So the chapter on the rhino poaching crisis is all about politics. So, sorry, emotions. And so the argument I tried to make there is that there is a politics of hysteria going on there, and that hysteria is a very generic feature of digital politics, of digital sort of engagement. So not hysteria in the sort of very problematic gender kind of ways in which it's often seen, but in a way, so the way I use it or define hysteria is as a way in which emotions sort of get, seemingly for many people, get out of control, out of hand, become extreme. And there's quite a lot of emerging literature on this actually that shows how this happens. And I've been flabbergasted by this because I've interviewed the sweetest people, you know, that become absolute horrendous people online, and offline they were really nice and, you know, offering me coffee and tea and all that, and online they were becoming absolute beasts, right? Like saying the most horrible things. So but theoretically the way I sort of deal with that in that chapter is that this kind of politics of hysteria has an instrumental side to it, in the sense that either through, for example, extreme violence or extreme forms of care, right? Different forms of emotional responses to, like in this case, the rhino example, or rhino poaching, both of them allow you sort of to take back control discursively. So both violence and the idea that there are heroes, that there are carers out there that do the thing for you, allow you to sort of take back control and promote them. And by being part and parcel of that, in that kind of bubble, you become invested in that in all kinds of new ways. And so at least that is how I sort of see how this can happen in the environmental sphere. But I think there are many more ways. I mean, this is a field that needs so much more thinking and research. And again, there is a little bit of research on this, but I haven't seen a lot. I don't know, maybe Elizabeth or Max, have you seen others? But this is rich stuff that needs more thinking through.
Yeah, I think that this work. Oh, Max, do you want to go?
Oh, you go ahead. You go ahead.
I think this really intersects in interesting ways with the development literature on representation, right? Including like celebrity efforts for development, including NGOs trying to recruit people to participate in kind of economic development. So I think of Stefano Ponte and Lisa Ritchie's work on Brand Aid, and many others, for instance. And I think that the instrumental component of it is really important because representations spark a little kind of particular kinds of politics of enrollment. They also have the effect of creating a world, telling a story, telling a narrative, representing a place, its set of political dynamics in a particular way, reducing the agency and the voice of people that are in those places, that are living those experiences. And yeah, so that kind of discursive control and I think one of the strong links here is the way that it's visual, the way that it's designed to be circulated. It's designed to be something that can easily move through space and through time, be universally applicable, and enroll people, distant people, in what is perceived of as a kind of local failing. So I think there could be some really useful intersections from that literature there.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I've come across some interesting things in journals, environmental ethics and consumer psychology, where they're really getting into some of the stuff and the neuropsychological aspects that are also being subjected to business ontology. You know, there are people who do work that, you know, is literally to try to reach you at the neurological level in branding schemes. It's really creepy. Just a previous comment, or a thought I had on that previous comment. I heard a really good radio show, I think it was The Dig, Jacobin, where they were asking about this sort of question of the relation of the conspiratorial theory and the left critical or theoretical approach to the emperor's clothes. And they had a really good discussion on the notion that, you know, the nature of the power of capital today is so diffuse and ubiquitous and seemingly ever present and also shadowy at the same time. And here financialization is a big example, that it's not a surprise that different political polarizations are taking to the same kind of question of conspiratorial theorizing. But what they point out in this interview is that, you know, it's really only the left that's willing to make the critique of capital at the same time. You know, it's the conspiratorial that stops at the idea that there's a big, you know, sort of send up that we're being told a lie and then looks for an easy target. And it's the critique of capital that goes to the question of the structure. So I think that interview is on The Dig, and I would recommend listening to that again. And I think it's also being echoed in these discussions of platform capital that, you know, there's a real question of powerlessness here as well, and our search for meanings in a very unmoored social reality.
Can you send that link?
Yeah, I'll look for it and send it if I find it.
Yeah, right. If only if it were as easy as conspiracy, right? I once was working with someone a long time ago who said that if only there was a silver bullet, it would be much easier to deal with.
On that note, we've got 4 minutes left. So any closing thoughts from the panel?
Closing thought is that I can't wait to get my hands on the rest of the book and to think more about these intersections across literatures in this really pressing moment. And I think the importance of, this comes back to me, I guess, to links to Andres Malm's work and about the centrality of questions of the environment, of the need to separate out these distinctions, the dualisms between nature and society, as a way to understand that the you know, contemporary economic and social structures of our world is intertwined.
I'll just end with a thank you. It's been really great listening to everybody talk and read everybody as well. These chat rooms are really, I think this is the best part about Zoom almost, is like you get this really rich text afterward that you get to think about later on. And just want to thank Bram again for inviting me on.
Yeah, thanks, Bram. Thanks for writing a book.
My God, yeah. Well, I just want to thank all of you as well. As I wrote in the preface, I mean, I nearly killed myself writing this book. So, and it was really, I mean, so for me, again, it's just thanks to, I just want to mention that, I think, to the common of intellectual interactions like this, that you can actually write a book at all, right? It was literally, I was just at some point kind of done with it because I just couldn't find that theoretical middle or theorization that I was looking for. And then Nick Schoenisek came with that book in 2015, and then Shoshana Zuboff like hit the thing home like in 2019. And then I was thinking, yeah, wow, now we have something to build on. And I think I would hope many more, including here and elsewhere, you know, help to further build this common understanding, and at the same time this kind of common political kind of you know feel that I think many of us share of how to confront these kind of new powers, including, Alice, you know, as you mentioned, like people in environmental organizations that are struggling with these kind of things, and thinking about these things in sometimes very similar ways, right? Like, so I really hope we can continue these conversations, and just want to thank you all for the incredible engagement, and Nathan and Amber for organizing and the STEP Center.
Well, thank you for taking your time, and this has been really great, and a perfect capping off of the Nature's Year, where everything is unresolved as it should be. But we have lots and lots to think about and work on.
But you still believe in the revolution, right, Amber?
Come on.
Always.
Oh.